They said the desert would strip us, that the sun could peel skin and memory until nothing human remained. We believed them, because by then we had already lost so much. But when the truck stopped and the soldiers told us to step down, there was something strange in their faces. Not pity, not cruelty, something in between. They did not take anything from us that day. Instead, they gave us blankets, heavy, olive-coloured, smelling of machine oil and dust. They were rough against the skin, but warm, too warm, almost alive. We held them and waited for the humiliation that never came. It's strange how mercy can feel more frightening than punishment. Some of us cried without knowing why. Others laughed quietly, because the absurdity of kindness in a place built for captivity was too much to bear. The desert wind moved through the fences like a breath, humming against the metal, and for a moment it sounded like the sea. The camp wasn't what we had imagined. It was orderly, precise. Rows of wooden barracks, fences that glowed under the noon light, towers that turned slowly like the eyes of tired gods. Steam hissed from a generator near the gates. Every sound echoed longer than it should, as if time itself stretched in the heat. The air smelled of copper and rain that never fell. We were told the Americans built the camp for discipline, not revenge. But discipline, when it's endless, becomes its own kind of punishment. They wrote our names on cards. Numbers followed, neat printed without accent or emotion. In those small black marks, our stories were flattened into inventory. Somewhere a typewriter clicked, and we stopped existing as who we were. Yet under the surface we still breathed, still wondered, still feared what might come next. Because even mercy, when you don't understand it, feels like a trick. The nights were cooler than we imagined. When the lights shut off and the generators quieted, the desert exhaled. You could hear the soft ticking of the earth cooling, the faint whisper of sand moving. The blankets, those coarse army-issued things, became our armour. We wrapped ourselves in them, not just for warmth, but to remember we were still something that could be protected. Days began to blur. The sun rose like an alarm and fell like a verdict. We were counted, assigned tasks, given food that smelled faintly of metal. We washed clothes in cold water, repaired canvas, gathered vegetables from the dry garden. There was routine, and within that routine a strange peace. It was not the peace of freedom, it was the peace of repetition. When everything else is uncertain, even monotony becomes comfort. Sometimes in the distance we saw trains pass. They moved slow, dragging lines of steam across the sky. The sound carried for miles and deep, resonant, mournful. We liked to imagine they were carrying someone home. Later we learned they carried copper. Metal, not men. But by then it didn't matter. Hope doesn't care about details. It only needs direction. The guards were young. Too young to be feared properly. They watched us like they were afraid to be caught watching. One of them dropped a tin of water once, and we saw his hands tremble as he picked it up. War had taken something from him too, though we didn't know what. Maybe that's what happens in war. Everyone loses something invisible. We began to change. The desert did that to you. Stripped you not of clothes or pride, but of certainty. The horizon was so large it made your thoughts smaller. At first we resisted it. Then quietly we surrendered. There's a moment, somewhere between exhaustion and acceptance, when the body stops fighting and simply observes. That's where we began to live again. Not as soldiers, not as prisoners, as witnesses. At night we sometimes heard music from somewhere beyond the wire. Maybe from the town, maybe from the radio tower that blinked red in the distance. The melody always ended before we could recognise it, and that made it stay longer in the mind. The next morning, we tried to hum it, but it always came out differently. That's how memory works. It changes each time you touch it. We thought often about the phrase, "they gave us blankets." It became something we repeated to ourselves in disbelief. Because those blankets meant more than warmth. They meant confusion. They meant that the world, even in war, refused to be entirely cruel. And when cruelty can't be trusted to stay cruel, hope begins to sneak back in. Each night, when the stars appeared sharp and white, the desert turned almost tender. The wire reflected moonlight like lace. Somewhere inside that stillness, we began to understand the title we were living. The stripping wasn't of our bodies. It was of illusion, of the idea that we understood what side we were on, what good and evil looked like. The blankets, those heavy, smelling things, were not gifts. They were mirrors, coverings for the parts of ourselves we weren't ready to see. When the first storm came, it was sudden. The wind screamed against the barracks, and the sand turned the air to gold. We thought it would tear everything apart, but it didn't. It left us standing in silence, coated in dust that shimmered like ash. The guards and prisoners looked at one another without words. For the first time, no one knew who was supposed to protect whom. After that storm, the camp was never quite the same. Something invisible had shifted, a quiet realization that this desert didn't belong to anyone. It tolerated us, tested us, reshaped us. It stripped away noise, leaving only what couldn't be destroyed, the pulse beneath fear. We would come to learn that being given a blanket can be more dangerous than being stripped. Because when someone covers you, you begin to believe in safety again, and when you believe in safety, you start to feel. Feeling in war is the most treacherous act of all, and yet even knowing that, we kept those blankets. Held them like memories, wrapped them around our sleep, and whispered into their folds as if they could hear. Maybe they could. Maybe every thread remembered something we had forgotten to say. The desert waited. It always waited. The sound of the generator started again the next morning, and the wind carried the smell of burnt metal and coffee. Another day, another count, another reminder that captivity doesn't always look like chains. Sometimes it looks like mercy you don't know how to refuse. And deep down, beneath the dust, we began to suspect that the stripping had only just begun. The desert has a way of teaching patience. It doesn't reveal its meaning all at once. It waits, watching until you've stopped trying to interpret it. Weeks passed, then months, and what once felt foreign began to take the shape of ritual. Every morning the same whistle, the same line of bodies moving through the same stretch of dust. Yet within that sameness, something subtle kept changing, something inside, slow as the growth of roots beneath sand. They started assigning us to the workshops. Metal and canvas, rope and wood. The air inside smelled of oil and iron filings, a strange echo of factories back home. Our hands learned again the language of making, folding, tightening, stitching, repairing. Each movement a small negotiation between obedience and memory. Sometimes the tools hummed faintly, powered by engines that looked half alive, copper joints breathing steam in the corners like animals asleep. The Americans called them prototypes. We called them ghosts, machines dreaming of war even when the world outside pretended to sleep. We began to speak less. Words felt too heavy, too slow for what we were learning to notice. Instead, we read each other's gestures, the lift of a brow, the turn of a wrist, the quiet rebellion in someone's pace. Silence became our secret language, a language that could not be censored. When you spend enough time in silence, you start to hear the smallest things. Footsteps over gravel, the flutter of paper in a pocket, the rhythm of your own pulse counting the hours. And in that rhythm, something began to loosen. Fear, or maybe it was pride. Hard to tell the difference when both beat the same way. Every few weeks a new transport arrived. The fresh prisoners came with the same questions we once had. Would they shave our heads? Force us to work in the sun? Feed us scraps? We watched them receive the same blankets and the same confusion. You could see it in their faces, the disbelief that mercy might exist here. It was like watching a mirror reflect your past self. We didn't tell them the truth right away. Some truths need to be discovered slowly, like the way your eyes adjust to night. Sometimes officers from the nearby base visited, clean uniforms, polished belts, voices clipped and efficient. They took notes, inspected the fences, reminded us that order was freedom, but order was simply the shape of their fear. You could feel it in the way they never stood still too long, how they avoided meeting our eyes. To see us too clearly would be to remember that the line between prisoner and guard is thinner than they were told. The seasons changed without permission. Spring appeared as a brief rumour. Cactus blooms the colour of rust, lizards moving faster across the ground. Then summer returned with its furnace breath. The sun didn't just burn, it carved. Our skin turned to bronze, our hair bleached to the colour of straw. We joked in silence that the desert was sculpting us into statues to remember itself by. Maybe it was. One evening, near the outer fence, a storm began building. The sky darkened not from clouds but from dust. It came from the west, rolling low, swallowing the horizon. The guards shouted, but their words vanished into the wind. We crouched, covered our faces with the blankets that had once felt like salvation. In that blinding storm, everything disappeared. The towers, the wire, even the sense of which direction was home. When the air finally cleared, we saw shapes emerging through the haze. Guards, prisoners, indistinguishable, covered in the same thin layer of red sand. For one heartbeat, no one remembered who was supposed to command whom. The desert had equalized us. After the storm, something softened between us and them. Not friendship, something quieter, more fragile, recognition. We were all temporary here. The guards began leaving small things by the fence, a piece of bread, a stub of pencil, a folded page from an old magazine. We responded with gestures rather than words. A clean uniform mended too neatly to be coincidence. A tin cup returned polished brighter than it had ever been issued. These were our conversations, unrecorded and unsanctioned. At night, the desert turned silver. The wind carried whispers from far away, the whistle of a train, the cough of a motorbike, laughter faint as radio static. Sometimes the horizon glowed faintly, like a furnace door opening somewhere beyond sight. They said the Americans were testing new engines, new fuels, new dreams of flight. We wondered if the world would recognize itself when the war ended, or if it too would need a blanket to hide beneath. The letters we sent home grew shorter. There were fewer lies left to tell. "We are safe," we wrote. "The sun is strong. The food is enough." Between those sentences lived everything unsaid. The ache of waiting, the slow theft of identity, the way the desert could make even grief feel distant. Occasionally a letter arrived in return, smelling faintly of salt and home. We passed it from hand to hand, touching the paper as if the touch could bridge continents. Then we folded it away, because in captivity even hope must be rationed. There was an American nurse who visited once a month. Always the same white uniform, the same precise smile. She checked our health, counted our ribs with professional distance, yet her eyes lingered longer each time, as if searching for proof of something she couldn't name. Once she left behind a box of chalk. No one knew if it was intentional. We used it to draw on the inside of the barracks wall, lines that turned into faces, faces into stories. By morning the dust had covered most of them, but a faint outline remained, like ghosts refusing to fade completely. In July, an old radio was repaired in the workshop. It hissed, cracked, then caught a signal. For a few minutes the static cleared and a voice filled the air. Italian, a broadcast from Rome. We froze. It spoke of armistice, of surrender, of shifting loyalties. The guards turned the dial, trying to silence it, but the words had already entered us. Surrender, freedom, confusion. We didn't know which was which anymore. The next day no one spoke of it, but the air felt different, thinner, like something fragile had been punctured. Some nights after that, we dreamed of being home but couldn't picture the streets. The colours were wrong, the sky too pale. We realised we were starting to forget details, the sound of rain on tile roofs, the smell of the sea. Memory itself was fading, like a photograph left too long in the sun. That terrified us more than captivity. To be forgotten is one thing. To forget yourself is another kind of death. The Americans brought in new supplies, books, paper, a small projector for film nights. They called it goodwill. We called it distraction. Still, when the reels flickered to life and black and white faces moved across the sheet, we couldn't look away. Cities we had known now rubble. Flags we once saluted torn. We watched silently as the world burned in monochrome. When the projector stopped, the darkness felt heavier than before, because it carried knowledge. After that, the blankets changed meaning again. They were no longer symbols of survival but of silence, something to hide under, to cover the shivering truth that maybe none of us would go home to the same world. Yet every night we wrapped ourselves in them, because ritual is stronger than revelation. The body needs what it remembers. There was a rumour that the war was ending, another that it was expanding. Every piece of news arrived too late to matter. The desert kept its own time, unbothered by headlines. The sun rose, the fences cast long shadows, the same steam engine coughed near the gate. Life continued in small defiant gestures, a laugh during inspection, a flower planted where no one was supposed to plant anything, the slow stitching of colour into a torn uniform, and through it all, a question grew, quiet, insistent. If we were no longer soldiers, no longer prisoners, what were we now? The answer hovered just out of reach like a mirage. Maybe we had already been stripped, not by them but by time. Maybe the blankets weren't gifts at all, but invitations, to cover ourselves until we dared to see who we had become. When dusk came, the desert turned the colour of old coins. The wind lifted, carrying the scent of engine oil and sage. We stood near the wire, the sky open above us, and for a moment it felt like standing at the edge of everything that had ever been lost. Somewhere a train sounded again, longer this time, as if calling. None of us moved. The sound faded, leaving only the pulse of the desert, steady, endless, waiting, and deep inside that waiting, a new kind of hunger began. Not for food, not for freedom, but for understanding. Because once you realise that mercy can wound as deeply as cruelty, you start to look for the meaning beneath both. That search, quiet, stubborn, unfinished, became the rhythm of our days. It was strange how time continued, even when nothing seemed to change. The days had become a kind of quiet tide, rolling in and out across the same stretch of desert, erasing the lines we drew to mark survival. We stopped counting the weeks. Numbers no longer mattered in a place that refused to measure itself by clocks. The only calendar was the body, the way skin hardened under the sun, the way eyes learned to narrow against the light, the way even silence developed seasons of its own. We had learned the sound of wind through wire, the difference between sand against wood and sand against skin. Those sounds became a language more honest than words. Some of us began to wonder if we were changing too much, if the desert was rewriting us molecule by molecule. Maybe that was what it meant to be stripped, not by hands or force, but by the slow erosion of what you once thought unshakable. There were mornings when the sky looked so clear it felt cruel. You could see the distant mountains floating like islands. The air shimmered as if reality were being boiled down to its barest elements. In those moments, something inside would ache with a sweetness that felt almost like homesickness, but sharper, as though you were longing not for where you came from, but for a version of yourself that no longer existed. The camp had begun to breathe differently. There was talk, whispers, carried between work shifts and through the mess hall, that the war in Europe was collapsing under its own weight. The guards spoke softer now, as if the very act of command required too much faith. The officers visited less often. Orders arrived in envelopes smudged with dust, and no one explained what they meant. The world outside was changing, but here the sun still rose on schedule. There was something both cruel and comforting about that. In the workshops, the machines had begun to fail. Their brass joints whined, their valves coughed. The younger guards tried to fix them but lacked the patience. So they called us in. We worked quietly, cleaning gears, replacing belts, coaxing life back into steel. It was strange, repairing the very things that symbolised our captivity. But in those small acts of maintenance, there was a strange intimacy, a recognition that broken things could still function if treated with care. Some of us began to see ourselves in those machines, worn, repurposed, yet still capable of movement. One afternoon, a letter arrived. Not for any of us, but for the camp itself. It came sealed in an envelope stamped with an emblem we didn't recognise. The commandant read it alone in his quarters. After that, something shifted. Routines tightened. Inspections grew less formal. The air felt uncertain, as if the desert were holding its breath. No one told us what the letter said, but we could feel it in the way the guards avoided our eyes. Change was coming, and no one knew whether it would arrive gently or all at once. That night, a storm gathered far beyond the hills. We watched it move toward us, slow, deliberate, like a creature waking from a long sleep. The first lightning cracked the sky open, and for a moment everything was illuminated. The wire, the barracks, the pale faces turned upward. Then darkness again. The storm never reached us. It hovered just beyond the camp, teasing, refusing to give rain. When it passed, we felt both relief and disappointment. Some part of us had wanted the storm to come, to wash something away, to prove that even nature could not stay indifferent forever. As the weeks stretched on, the blankets began to wear thin. The edges frayed, the seams loosened. Some used them as curtains, some as bedding, some as the only thing soft enough to cradle a memory. The fabric held everything: sweat, dust, breath, tears. Each thread became a record of our quiet persistence. We joked, when we had the energy, that the blankets had become part of us. It wasn't a joke, not really. Then came the day of the photographs. A jeep arrived carrying a man with a camera and another with a clipboard. They said they were documenting the camp for archives. We were told to line up outside the barracks, to look healthy, to look grateful. The sun was unforgiving. When the shutter clicked, it felt like a small explosion, a sound that sealed us in time. Somewhere those images might still exist. Rows of women half smiling into a brightness they could not bear, wrapped in the same coarse blankets that had greeted them on their first day. Later, when we returned to the barracks, none of us spoke. There was something indecent about being turned into a picture. The camera had taken something from us we didn't know we still owned, the illusion of invisibility. That night sleep came fitfully. The generator hummed too loudly as if mocking us, but amid the restless dark, one thought kept returning. Maybe we had never been invisible at all. Maybe someone, somewhere, was watching, trying to understand what it meant to survive decently in indecent times. The next morning, a guard approached with a clipboard. He was trembling slightly. We thought it was another inspection, but instead he read a list of names. 10 in total. No explanation. Those called were told to pack. The rest were to continue as usual. The selected women stood in silence, each holding her blanket folded over her arm. We watched them load into a truck and disappear into the heat haze. They never came back. No one ever told us where they went. The guards avoided the question. The desert, too, refused to answer. For days afterward, the camp felt hollow. Every sound echoed longer. The work slowed. Even the wind seemed cautious. It was in that emptiness that the deeper stripping began. We stopped expecting fairness. We stopped expecting sense. Instead, we began to listen differently, to the silence between footsteps, to the breathing of the desert. It was as though the land itself was whispering that truth was not something you learned, but something you endured. In the evenings, when the heat subsided, we gathered near the fence and stared at the sky. The stars were impossibly sharp, like holes punched through the darkness. Someone once said that light travels from the past, that every star is a message from what has already died. We wondered what messages we were sending out, what kind of light we would leave behind when this ended. Then, unexpectedly, a group of local women appeared outside the camp one afternoon. They came carrying baskets, led by a priest from the nearby town. They said they had brought gifts, fruit, bread, even cloth. The guards hesitated, but allowed the exchange. The women's faces were lined with the same dust as ours, but their eyes were clear. They didn't look at us like enemies. They looked at us like reflections of something they didn't want to become. One of them handed me a piece of fabric patterned with tiny blue flowers. I remember thinking that it was too beautiful for war. I kept it hidden under my blanket for weeks, unfolding it at night just to remind myself that beauty still existed somewhere, stubborn and unbroken. That night, I dreamed of water. Clear, cold, endless. In the dream, we were all standing at the edge of a river, washing the dust from our arms, laughing quietly as if we had been reborn. When I woke, the air was dry as ever, but the dream lingered. It stayed in the corners of my thoughts, like the taste of salt on lips long after the sea is gone. By then, some of the guards had begun to leave. Reassigned, they said. Others arrived, younger, uncertain. The world outside was shifting again. The radio confirmed what we had begun to suspect. The war was ending. Or maybe it was only changing shape. The words meant little to us now. Freedom had become an abstract idea, like infinity, beautiful but unreachable. What would we even do with it if it came? Go home, where was home now? The blankets, worn and thin, became relics. We kept them not because we needed them, but because they had witnessed everything. They were the first and last things that truly belonged to us. Sometimes I thought that if we ever returned to Italy, I would carry mine across the ocean, just to prove that softness can survive even in captivity. When the order finally came, to prepare for transfer, it didn't feel real. Trucks lined up outside the gate, the same way they had the day we arrived. The guards handed out new tags, new destinations. We stood in line once more, blanketed figures against the horizon. Some smiled, some wept, most did neither. As we waited, I felt the weight of the blanket over my shoulders, heavier than ever. And in that moment I understood. It wasn't just something given to keep us warm. It was something we had filled, with our breath, our stories, our invisible endurance. The desert had stripped us, yes, but not of dignity. It had taken away illusion, pride, certainty, and left behind something quieter, something closer to truth. And as the truck started, and the camp grew smaller in the distance, I couldn't tell if we were leaving captivity or carrying it with us. When they told us the war was over, it didn't sound like freedom. It sounded like static. The announcement came through the camp's radio one morning, a voice calm and distant, speaking of victory, peace, and the end of suffering. But the words floated over us like dust, visible but impossible to hold. The guards listened too, their faces unreadable. When the broadcast ended, no one cheered. The silence that followed was heavier than any chain. Because what the voice didn't say was what would happen to those who had survived. We expected orders, instructions, explanations. None came. Days passed and still the gates stayed closed. We worked, ate, slept, as if nothing had changed. Freedom, it turned out, could look a lot like captivity when no one told you where to go. The Americans were waiting for something, clearance, papers, perhaps the right moment to remember that we were human again. The desert, meanwhile, seemed untouched by history. The same wind, the same light, the same indifference. Sometimes we wondered if the world beyond the fences truly existed, or if we had dreamed it long ago. The war might have ended elsewhere, but here, in this place that swallowed sound, everything remained suspended. And yet small signs began to appear. Guards started removing insignias from their uniforms. Letters arrived with fewer blacked-out lines. The tone of the camp shifted from command to confusion. Some guards even smiled now, brief, uncertain smiles that said, "We don't know what to do with you anymore." The power they had worn like armour was melting off their shoulders. We almost pitied them. Almost. Then came the first departure. A group of prisoners, women from another barrack, were told to pack. Trucks came at dawn, engines idling, the same way they had on the day we arrived. We stood by the fence and watched them climb aboard. No one waved. No one wanted to risk believing it was real. But when the trucks rolled out and didn't return, something inside us began to flicker. Maybe this was it. Maybe soon it would be our turn. That night I lay awake and thought about what we would return to. The cities we'd left behind might no longer exist. The homes we remembered might be occupied by strangers or ghosts. And what were we now? Not soldiers, not prisoners, not even citizens of the same world. The war had stripped away the names that once gave us shape. What remained was harder to define. Endurance, memory, the quiet instinct to keep breathing. In the weeks that followed, more groups were released. Each departure felt both hopeful and cruel. Hopeful because it meant the end was real. Cruel because it reminded us how slowly mercy moves. Our names were not called. We began to prepare ourselves for the possibility that they never would be. One evening, as the sun sank into the horizon like a dying ember, I saw a guard sitting near the fence, his rifle laid beside him. He was watching the light change, the same way we did. For a long time, neither of us moved. Then he took something from his pocket, a photograph folded and worn, and looked at it for a long while. When he stood, he left the photo behind, pressed into the sand. After he walked away, I went to where he'd been sitting. The picture showed a woman and a child. Their faces were blurred, but the emotion was clear. He hadn't left it by mistake. He'd left it because he didn't know what to do with it anymore. That night I dreamed again of the blankets. In the dream they were not olive or coarse. They were made of light, soft, endless, floating through the air like sails. Each one carried the outline of a face, a memory, a name. They covered the desert, turning it silver. When I woke, I realised that perhaps we had never truly been given those blankets. Perhaps we had woven them ourselves, out of every small mercy, every act of survival. The final order came without ceremony. We were to leave at dawn. No explanation, no destination. We packed what little we had. A tin cup, a letter, a scrap of blue fabric, the worn blanket folded neatly on top. The trucks waited, engines humming like distant thunder. We climbed aboard. The guards didn't look at us. Some saluted awkwardly. Others simply turned away. The gates opened for the first time, and the desert stretched ahead, unchanged, eternal, both promise and warning. As we drove away, the camp grew smaller until it was just a blur against the horizon. The towers, the barracks, the wire, they all dissolved into the light. The wind carried the dust behind us, erasing our tracks before they could harden. No one spoke for a long time. Words seemed inadequate. What could you say after living in a world built entirely from silence? One of the women began humming, a melody without words, something old, maybe sacred. Others joined softly. The sound rose and fell with the rhythm of the road. It wasn't a song of triumph. It was a song of continuation, of things that refused to die quietly. The road wound through miles of barren land. Occasionally we passed small towns, their rooftops glinting in the distance. People stopped to watch as we went by, children, workers, a woman holding a basket. They didn't cheer or wave. They just looked, the way people look at something they can't quite name. Maybe they didn't know whether to see us as victims or villains. Maybe we didn't either. Somewhere beyond the mountains lay the promise of ships, and beyond the ships the sea. The thought of water again made my throat ache. It had been so long since I'd seen it that I wasn't sure I would recognise its colour. But I knew its sound would break me open. That night we stopped in an open field. The guards, now just men in faded uniforms, built a fire. We sat around it, wrapped in our blankets, watching the flames. The air smelled of wood smoke and oil, of something ending. The youngest among us whispered that maybe this was what freedom felt like. Not joy, not release, but the quiet awareness of being unbound. She might have been right. When dawn came, the sky was pale and endless. The trucks moved again, slower this time, as if reluctant to finish the journey. The closer we came to the coast, the more the air changed. You could taste salt in it, faint but real. Then, finally, the sound of waves, a rhythm older than war, older than grief. We climbed down from the trucks and stood in silence, facing the water. No one told us what to do next. The officers who had escorted us were busy with paperwork, their voices low, detached. So we waited like we always had. But this waiting felt different. It wasn't imposed. It was chosen. The horizon shimmered, a thin line between earth and sky. We realised that line had always been there, inside us, the boundary between who we were and who we might become. I walked to the edge of the surf and let the water touch my feet. It was colder than I remembered, shockingly alive. The waves broke against the shore, erasing footprints almost as soon as they appeared. Behind me, the others began to step forward too, one by one, each carrying her own silence. The blankets were still around our shoulders. Some were torn, some stained, some almost transparent from wear. And yet, as the wind caught them, they lifted slightly, just enough to move like sails ready for a voyage. For a moment we stood there, caught between sea and sky, past and future, stripped of everything but the will to continue. We had thought they would strip us. They had, but not in the way we expected. They had taken our certainty, our arrogance, our illusions of control. And in return, they had given us something that could never be confiscated. The knowledge that even in captivity, compassion can exist. That even in silence we are seen. That even after everything we can still cover one another with warmth. As the sun rose higher, we turned from the water. The trucks would take us somewhere new, perhaps home, perhaps nowhere. It didn't matter. We carried our blankets, our ghosts, our lessons, and for the first time in years we didn't feel cold, because sometimes what's given to protect you ends up transforming you. And sometimes what strips you bare teaches you how to begin again. The wind rose, carrying the scent of salt and smoke, and for a moment, it almost sounded like the desert breathing, endless, patient, alive, and that was enough.